Of the Pittsburgh Steelers is an author, business owner, and national speaker. He is the son of Dan Rooney, the late Steelers chairman and Pro Football Hall of Famer. Jeremi Duru is a professor of sports law at American University and serves as counsel to the Fritz Pollard Alliance. Jim on Twitter is at ADiffWay2Win. That's the number 2. And Professor Duru is at Jeremi Duru. Jim, Jeremy, thank you so much for taking time to join us. I guess let's start here. The past few weeks, really, since the murder of George Floyd, have been a real awakening around the country for the need to address systemic racism. And both of you are obviously part of the sports world. And of course, athletes and teams and leagues are really stepping up in their public statements and their commitment to activism to really address these issues. I wonder if you could both just share just your assessment of how the sports community has reacted to recent events. And how do you feel this maybe could be different from other times in the past?
So, I think this is a powerful moment, and it's a sort of a pleasure and privilege to be part of something. And it's because of something so horrible, something that was horrific, and something I think we all should feel a level of outrage for. So how do you take that moment and make sense of it, which I think we all have to do, but then make sure that we're doing something that is constructive, that really meets the awakening that we're feeling, and that there is catharsis and then there's transformation. And it's great to have a cathartic experience, and we all feel that desire to change and the hope and the possibility. But transformation to me really means at the end there is a changed state than what there was beforehand. And I think certainly in my lifetime, I was young in the 1960s. I was born in the 1960s. This is the first moment in my lifetime where it feels to me that you really have an entire community of the people, white people really, and certainly it's not the entire community, but ready to really look at making a significant change. And I think the voices of athletes have been, some of, if not the most consistent folks speaking to the white community, telling them that, look, this is an opportunity where you have to look at yourself differently. You have to reflect in a way that is more meaningful, is more painful, is more challenged than it's ever been, but that this provides you an opportunity to really bring that transformation about. So from that perspective, the voices the voices of athletes, I think, means so much to bringing about that possibility of true transformational change.
Yeah, I'm proud of sport. Sport has the power to push societies in progressive directions. We all know that. We've studied it. I'm proud of sport today, and I'm proud of the athletes. I mean, it's, without question, it's the athletes that are pushing the movement. It's the athletes that have come out and said things must change, and then in response, the organizations have begun to look toward change. So you've got collegiate athletes who say, I'm not going to play, I'm not going to work out unless this changes. And you've got head coaches who immediately say, yes, let's look into this, let's change. Now, 2 months ago, that's not happening. 1 year ago, that's not happening. We are in a movement now where athletes have more power than they've had in a long time, and they're using it. I'm proud of the National Football League, which by its own admission made a mistake several years ago. And I'm proud that, the players put together that video where the players said, we want the National Football League to say Black Lives Matter. We want them to say this. And, the league through Roger Goodell said Black Lives Matter, that this means to us that we were wrong. Now, we're living in a society where a lot of people will not admit that they're wrong or that they ever were wrong. And so to see an institution being pushed by its athletes to admit, yes, we were wrong, and to move forward is impressive to me.
Jeremy, you kind of touched on this briefly, and I definitely want to talk to you both about the NFL, because obviously you're both very well connected and involved there. But you mentioned the collegiate athletes, Jeremy, and I know you wrote a piece a couple weeks ago for the Undefeated about how this has really been such a pivotal moment for college athletes and their ability to use their voice and really try to create change. I wonder if you could talk about just, I mean, tell us your thoughts behind the piece and everything, but more so like what impact could this have on college athletes going forward and the power that they have? Because obviously that's been a real issue for college athletes in having power. We see professional athletes doing it, but college athletes really have been, I think, more limited throughout history. Maybe talk about just what impact this moment can have on their future.
Sure. So the piece very briefly came out just a couple of days after college athletes began to be activists on this. Florida State University football players and the University of Missouri football players. And so I wrote about the power that they were showing that they had. And I talked about that same University of Missouri football team a few years ago refusing to play a Saturday game. Mm-hmm. The president of the university did not step down because there had been all sorts of racial issues on campus. The president had, in the players' view, not been up to the task of dealing with them. And the president stepped down. And it came out in the press later that had the president not stepped down, the university would have owed BYU, the opponent in that upcoming game, $1 million, together with whatever other revenue they would have lost as a consequence of not playing the game. So what the athletes did in that Missouri situation was show that we have power to drive the economics. And what we're seeing in the more recent instances, the ones that I mentioned with Florida State and Missouri, since I wrote the piece, we've had University of Texas, Oklahoma State, is these student athletes showing that they have leverage. And the thing that's most remarkable about it, Ian, is that these are student athletes who operate in a system where they do not receive salary, but at least the revenue-producing athletes make huge amounts of money for their school. So if you have, with the promise, the hope that eventually they'll be able to be professionals themselves. So if you have student athletes who are willing to risk that potential by being activists, then you have a movement. And this is something that we've really never seen, at least not in half a century, from student athletes. The ability to flex their power when indeed they are in very vulnerable positions.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It speaks to just if they're willing to do that, what more can they do? And if they're willing to sacrifice that much, their impact can really be exponentially greater. Yeah. So that's a really important point. Let's get back to the NFL for now. They came out with a new $250 million plan over 10 years to support social justice initiatives led by players and teams. I wonder, Jim, maybe if you could tell us a little bit about that program and maybe talk about some of the Steelers' efforts in this space, and if both of you could address what you hope to see come out of this new 10-year plan.
To sort of take your question and follow up with what Jeremy just said, I just wrote this book about my father, and mm-hmm. I think my father's life is particularly of note because, he was a white man with power and influence, and he was always willing to raise the voices of, other folks who didn't have the same positional power, but he believed, that there absolutely should be that equanimity, and that was the culture that he created. There was, there has always been, or at least throughout my life in the Steelers, the sense of welcoming and the sense of safety and security in having a different voice. And, when you look at the contributions of so many of our players going back to the early 70s, the Steelers drafted more players from the HBCUs than any other team. That team goes on to win 4 Super Bowl championships in 6 years. And I can name several of these stories, but one that I think about is my friend Mel Blount, who is a Hall of Fame cornerback that actually changed the league. But Mel started the Mel Blount Youth Home for at-risk children. And, he started it in a farm area in Western Pennsylvania. So he had grown up in the segregated South in Georgia. Starts this really important charitable effort and development effort in an area of Western Pennsylvania. The KKK actually protested Mel's development of this organization, and then Mel has had, I think, 30 successful years with this endeavor now, supporting children throughout Western Pennsylvania. And that to me is just such an example of the culture that was created. And Mel regularly talks about my father's influence on his life, his willingness to do these types of things. I'm not trying to give my father credit for Mel's courage and contribution, but creating an environment that you feel enough confidence in your own agency that you can allow someone else to have their agency, their safety, their voice, I think is so significant. And I think that is where the power dynamic has to begin to see things differently and understand that, you do have a responsibility if you are in power to raise the voices of others who aren't. And you have to have enough confidence in yourself to understand that there's going to be some differences, that you're going to hear views that aren't your views, and that, that still is a critical step for you. And because I think that so much of this stuff comes down to, people's desire to sort of hold power. And the Steelers have been more effective. We've won, more games, more championships. Our success is documented. And I believe in a lot of ways it is a fundamentally different dynamic in terms of not just, saying, hey, these folks are important, but creating an environment where voices were welcomed, where a sense of safety was created, and where agency was valued and enhanced.
Yeah, and it's incredibly important. And I know we definitely want to get to more about creating inclusive cultures and talk about the Rooney Rule, which your father obviously is named after him. So and was instrumental in implementing in the NFL. So we'll definitely get to that. Jeremi, I wonder maybe if you could just chime in first, just talk about what you hope to see going forward with this new plan and how you hope really this can make a difference.
Yeah. So obviously, money is effective when used strategically, and so the question will be how it's used. And I trust the folks at the league to consult those who will help them to use it most effectively and beneficially. I think the key point beyond that, though, is that the league makes clear to all, externally as well as internally, that this is just the beginning. The league got a lot of pushback when it agreed to, I think it was $100 million. Is that what it was when the agreement with the Players Foundation? And the league got pushback. Then the argument was, hey, the league just bought them off, which I didn't agree with. Particularly if the league is committed to continuing beyond the money. So what I would say in this case is that the league has to make clear that this is just the beginning, that we are going to continue, whether economically or otherwise, pushing for racial justice across this nation, and we will use our platform to amplify us. And going to the point you just made, Ian, the league also continues to work internally to create systemic progress on this issue, such that going forward, the league will always be, whether or not they are giving money to any causes, will always be a force in the direction of progressive change, diversity, equal opportunity, and the respect for racial justice.
Yeah, exactly. And so let's get into that, and let's talk about the Rooney Rule and how the league is addressing inclusion in its own ranks. Just for those who don't know, the Rooney Rule, adopted under Commissioner Paul Tasleby in 2003. I mean, those who don't know, not in this conversation, but those who might be listening. Later expanded in 2009, and then again, most recently, just in May of this year in 2020. It's the NFL's policy that requires every team to interview at least one or more minority candidate for head coaching and general manager and equivalent front office positions. And then most recently, last month in May, the league expanded it again to now require every team to interview at least 2 external minority candidates for head coaching jobs and at least 1 candidate for coordinator jobs, senior football operations, and general manager positions. Obviously, in both of your lifetime and your work, you're both very involved in this space. Jim, maybe you could just start us off, obviously, with your father being so instrumental in creating the Rooney Rule. And you write about this in your book. Tell us just about the origins of it and how it came to be.
Well, so there's the origins of the rule and sort of my father's pathway there. I talked about the integration of the Steelers in the 1970s, and that being, this determined commitment of my father's when he took over the team in the mid 1960s. And you saw the results there. There was, Tony Dungy was named as the Steelers. He was the first African-American defensive coordinator, and actually the youngest defensive coordinator in NFL history when the Steelers named him that back in, I think it was 81 or 82. There are these historical moments that the Steelers have been part of. My father also, and I talk about this in the book, was involved in a conflict in Ireland that was a thousands of year conflict that had sectarian violence between Catholics and Protestants. And in all of these situations, I talked about this ability or willingness to, create agency and create voice for those who didn't have it. And over and over again, that's sort of the hallmark of my father's career. So you get to, Tony Dungy gets fired in 2000 at the end of the 2002 season by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and Cyrus Mary, Johnny Cochran commissioned this study by a woman named Janice Madden at the University of Pennsylvania. And, the study demonstrates that Black coaches, minority coaches are getting fired with a greater record of success than non-minorities. And, I think that's where Commissioner Tagliabue, my father, Jeff Pash, there are a couple other folks in the league really, I think corporations in those cases a lot of times use something like that and they might create a PR response, but oftentimes try to sort of, bury the lead, if you will. And I think one of the significant things is that those folks really embraced Cyrus Mary and his work and said, okay, this is a constructive point to really make this change. And so then you got the NFL Diversity Committee. You had the development of the Fritz Pollard Alliance right around that same time. So, similar to not globally, but in the NFL, you had a moment and you had people respond to that moment in a meaningful and significant way and really try to build a process and policy that certainly for the first 10, 12 years of the policy, showed, significant progress and a role my father played there, along with a gentleman named John Wooten was as, the champion or the chief advocate. And you really saw that when you had that advocacy on the leadership level, not only did you have sort of someone, folks who had the courage to step up and create the policy, but then the advocacy to make sure that it was being implemented effectively, and you had pretty significant results early on. Now we're at the point where we can talk about the last 5 years, the challenges, and what got us to the point where we made some significant changes. But I'll turn it over to Jeremi, because he knows pieces of the origin story that may also be important.
Sure. So I'll just say that Jim's given it very nicely. What I think is interesting about the origin of the Rooney Rule is that before the Rooney Rule came to be and before the Fritz Pollard Alliance came to be, you had the sort of activism, although it wasn't public, that we're seeing now on the part of coaches and executives of color in the league. So after the report came out that Jim referenced, John Wooten, who's a former great offensive lineman in the league, is one of the first Black executives in the league. He called together a bunch of coaches and executives at the Combine in 2003. So it's February, March timeframe. And they all met at the Hyatt, and they were in this room. And you had ultimately over 100 people, coaches down from quality control assistants all the way up to general managers of clubs, talking about how unfairly they felt they'd been treated over the course of years. And there was tremendous fear in that room. There was fear that if they came together as an organization, if they spoke up as an organization, that they would be essentially, banished, excommunicated from the league. I mean, there was a sense that they would not be able to keep their jobs and wouldn't be able to get new ones. But in that room, and there was someone, someone stood up, I can't remember who it was, and if I did, I wouldn't reveal it, but said, we'll get our heads cut off if we come together on this. And then some others. Terry Robisky, the great coach we're likely all familiar with, stood up and said, well, if they're going to start cutting heads, let mine be first. And that really started the ball moving. And other coaches got involved, and executives got involved, talking, became an animated meeting. And Tony Dungy finally said, hey, listen, we've got to stand together on this. And out of that meeting was birthed the Fritz Pollard Alliance. And so the Fritz Pollard Alliance, moving forward from that meeting, became, in essence, an advocate for the Rooney Rule, which had just come into being but wasn't being applied very evenly, and an advocate for the group of individuals of color in the league as well, to push the league to try and create greater opportunity for people of color. And it was the push from that group, together with people like Mr. Rooney, Jim's father, that led Paul Tagliabue to issue the first ever fine under the rule against the Detroit Lions for not interviewing a head coach of color during their search then in 2003.
So, I mean, since then, obviously, there's been, like you mentioned, Jim, the first few years were certainly, I shouldn't say first, the first majority of the years, there was definitely effective. I mean, you had, I think there were 21 or 22 or something minority coaches hired since the Rooney Rule was enacted, and only 10, before them in the entire history of the NFL. So that doubled right away. And you mentioned Tony Dungy became the first African-American head coach to win a Super Bowl later on with the Colts. And you had, I think I read the record high was about 9 coaches of color in 2011. So there was definitely clear progress made. But then in recent years, like you mentioned, not as much progress, kind of almost like a decline, you can say. I mean, there were the same number of African-American head coaches and GMs this past year in 2020 as there were in 2003 when the rule was enacted. So I wonder maybe if you could both talk about just the assessment of how that has gone so far, and what these new changes to the rule could have on the future of this issue.
Well, so Jeremy was a contributor with me on the book, and we had a lot of conversations about what brought this drought about. And certainly you had the rule, and you had sort of some coaches that were prepared, but did we somehow fail in building the pipeline? And so addressing the idea that you want this to be sustainable and long term. The bias around and a horrible bias for so many years around African American quarterbacks, and the result that had on quarterback coaches and then offensive coordinators, which, because the rules keep favoring offense more and more, people are looking for offensive coaches to be their head coach, and we have sort of this big delta there where you have a substantial amount of coaches on the defensive side. So on the offensive side of the ball, and again, it goes back to bias and institutional racism, that feeder is not where you would like it to be. And then there's just rudimentary things like technology and innovation that Tony Dungy talks a lot about. Are we using the best practices throughout the entire interview process? And is there sort of is it just a stale process, not just the Rooney Rule, but the entire way that the coaching process is impacted? And then Jeremy brought up a great point about my father passing away and John Wooten retiring, and the importance of individuals. And so those are some of the factors I think that led to this delta. Jeremy, I don't know if you want to follow up on that one.
Yeah, I'll just follow up with one additional thing. The thing about the Rooney Rule is, and people don't often talk about this, but the requirement is of a meaningful interview. And so it's not just that there be an interview, but that it be meaningful. Now, how meaningful is defined has kind of become a common law thing. There's no text that says what is meaningful and what is not. But we know that the Rooney Rule won't be effective if in a club owner's mind they're thinking, there's no way I'm going to hire this guy, but I'll interview him for 6 hours. I'll do everything under the rule, but I'm not hiring him. I know it. Everyone knows it inside the organization. If there's any sort of sense like that, even though the interview is taking place, it's actually a violation of the rule. And so I think that one reason that we've seen kind of the, kind of the backslide, I guess, Ian, is that we haven't had, in my view, the level of enforcement that is worthy of the rule. I mean, the one time a team has been found to have violated the rule and been fined was the Detroit Lions circumstance that I mentioned from 2003. But there have been, half a dozen or more other instances where there seems to be some indication over the course of years that maybe the interview was not a meaningful interview. Maybe somebody who wasn't a person of color had the job in the bag, and so the interviews were sham interviews. But there hasn't been any determination to that extent, to that end by the league, and there hasn't been there haven't been any penalties handed out either. And so, I believe that maybe clubs have become a little more lax in their commitment, not just to the rule, but to what the rule is supposed to create in the process. And maybe that may have something to do with the backslide that we've suffered. I think that with these new additions to the Rooney Rule, these adjustments, additions, enhancements, Ian, that you mentioned, I think together with hardy enforcement, I think we'll be able to see a turnaround going forward.
That's a good point too. And I think, another one of the issues is not only just in enforcing the rule, but it's also kind of addressing the core issue, right? And Jim, you mentioned bias, and that's really what it comes down to, right? When we're talking about any of these issues, whether it's addressing racism and in all sectors of life, it's about your biases and the way you perceive or the way they play a role in the decisions you make and how you interact with others. And we mentioned, earlier before we started the interview, how bias is the subject of our digital learning series right now this week at Rise. So maybe we could take a minute to talk about that and that concept and how it applies here. So I guess first, just how would you define bias in just your own perspective of it?
Well, look, I think we all have biases. I think science demonstrates that we all have bias. We have ideas, mindsets, behaviors that, habits have built up, and there's all types of science on habits as well these days. I think so the idea that me as a white man who grew up, in predominantly white schools and white institutions, white churches, white places where folks in the business worlds are. I mean, that is still very much the world we live in. So that wouldn't affect me is I think just not true. What look, I certainly was blessed with this fortune and this magical experience of growing up around the Steelers locker room and having guys like Mel Blount and Joe Green and Franco Harris, not only as heroes of mine, but they became mentors of mine in so many ways. And to look at seeing guys that I appreciated so much of what they did is okay, creating that sense of empathy and intervening on what might be, I don't want to say natural thought processes, but what my environment would naturally see or not see. So I've been blessed with that level of intervention, but I also feel that there is an education from my father, from different communities that I have worked to be a part of, and Jeremi, who I consider a good friend and contributed with this, where we need to be challenged and we need to find ways that we're not going to be comfortable in order to make ourselves better in general, and then specifically around race and bias, that someone who is different than us is going to be able to, help us reflect on, that is a mindset, that's an attitude, that's a behavior that ultimately, is continuing something that certainly I don't want to be proactive in continuing.
Jeremy?
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, I think it's all right. And I think that, we all have biases. It's the way it is. The problem with biases is that they're irrational. And, when we're talking about the business world, or the NFL, corporate America, irrationality is bad. It's bad for you in so many ways. And so the key for us, and I say us, I mean us here on this call, but us as a nation, us as a human race, is to recognize that we would be better off without our biases. And so will all biases be eliminated? Probably not. But to find a way to reduce, to the extent possible, our own biases makes us more effective in all that we do. And so I think it's often the case that people need to recognize the benefit they'll gain from doing something. Maybe it shouldn't be that way. Maybe we as humans should be altruistic first, but I don't think most humans are. I think most humans need to see the gain that they'll experience to really get enthusiastic about something, some sort of intervention. So if people can recognize, hey, we all will be better as individuals, in our own personal lives, in our professional lives, as a community, as a nation, as a world, if we reduce our biases, then I think we'll start to get some of that reduction. The question is, how do we convince people, hey, you're better off not being, not having a racial bias or a gender bias? That's the question. That's $1 million question.
Right.
If we could answer that on this call, we'd be in great shape.
Yeah. Well, I want to bring it back to the Rooney Rule for a second, because you talk about how, okay, so that the Rooney Rule really addresses the process, right? It makes sure that it's creating opportunities for people to reach these higher levels of coaching and executive positions. But I guess the question is, how does it address the core issue? How does the Rooney Rule address implicit bias, right? Because, you can, like you said, Jeremy, you can get in the door and you can have a 6-hour interview, but if you already have your mind made up, you're not going to get that opportunity. Or sorry, if the person across the table has their mind made up, you're not going to get that opportunity. So how does the rule address that issue of implicit bias, and what more can be implemented to make sure that core issue is addressed?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there are two things. I think the first thing is that, there are all sorts of studies that show, that if you sit two people down together who are different in whatever ways and get them talking about something that they both know something about, whether it's how to manufacture tires or, how to make this best sort of soda pop, that the superficial boundaries between them start to melt down a little bit, start to break down a little bit, and they take the other's insights to heart more aggressively. And so the idea behind the Rooney Rule is you get in the Rooney Rule as it's applied in the National Football League, is you get a couple of people who are really interested in this thing called football, and you sit them down and you get them both to talk passionately about football, that the decision maker of the two will begin to take the candidate of the two more seriously. So that's the idea. It's a sociological, theoretical idea, which I think is borne out in many different case studies and circumstances. And as a consequence of that, Ian, I think that there is the possibility for, and we've seen it, and it's the goal of the rule, to, even when you've got somebody whose mind is made up, that person's mind perhaps changes because they're actually in the room. John Wooten, who Jim Rooney mentioned earlier, and I talked about it a little bit as well, has this great story where somebody, one of the club owners, questioned him years ago when he was talking about the importance of the Rooney Rule concept, even before the Rooney Rule came to be. He was an executive in the league. The owner said, well, why are you, I know who I want for the job, so I don't know why you're pushing this, this thing. I know who I want. Let me just go get who I want. And John said, I accept that you know who you want, but the question isn't who you want. The question is who's going to be best for the job. And, those are two very different questions with quite often two very different answers. So the Rooney Rule idea seeks to shift the question from who do I want to who is best for the job.
And Ian, a little bit of patting on the back here of my father, but
it's well deserved.
Studied his career. In so many ways, my father provided the example for this. The Steelers have had 3 coaches in 50 years. We're I think we're at 52 years now. And what that does, everyone loves to talk about culture, but it's such an advantage to not be changing that position. It just has such a big impact on your team culture, on continuity, on people's understanding of what their roles and responsibility are on the football field. And so if you look at my father's hiring process, particularly with Mike Tomlin, we took probably twice the amount of time that everyone else, that most teams take when they hire someone. We started with 37 candidates, which I think is probably double what other teams start with. In there were several minority candidates. We get down to 12. We get down to 5. We had conducted our technical Rooney Rule process, and then Mike Tomlin was still included in the process. So we had done, sort of everything you were supposed to do to achieve the rule. But, my father, just really felt that Mike was the right fit culturally for us. And it was Kevin Colbert, our GM, my brother Art, who had talks with Mike about X's and O's. My father really turned the conversation towards, Mike's family and what were the indications that Mike would have telling stories about his relationship with his mother, his wife, his children, that give these indications that, is there a cultural fit? Can you see that this person values relationships and values others in a way that is consistent with what we're trying to achieve with the Pittsburgh Steelers? And so, you get Mike. He is the longest tenured and the most successful African-American coach. And it is all because my father conducted this process, and he did it 3 times in a pretty effective manner. The 2 guys before Mike are both in the NFL, in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, but it goes to what Jeremy's saying, that if you have a process that really values what you want in the job and not who you want, you're able to bring people that look different, create an experience with them that really shows that Mike Tomlin doesn't look like the Rooneys, but at the end of the day, he has been a perfect cultural fit for our organization, and we have been more successful because of it. And I laugh. I think in a lot of ways, Mike not being the Rooney Rule candidate proves out the rule even more, because we went through such a determinative process. We found someone who's been successful. Certainly there's been management decisions along the way. It wasn't the hiring and then we've done nothing else, but it was creating, this idea that someone fit in our culture so effectively. And we went through a process that allowed us to really experience and understand this person that looks different than us, and saw that they did have that perfect fit.
Can I follow up, Ian, on what Jim said? Because it's something Jim mentioned, which I think is critical, that we've not really talked about much. And I don't know that people who think about the Rooney Rule think about it a whole lot. And that is, Jim talked about how when searching for a head coach and hiring Tomlin, the club took its time. It took a lot of time. That's one of the ideas behind the Rooney Rule is to slow things down so you can be intentional and deliberative about your search. There's a lot of data that indicates that when people have to make snap decisions right off the cuff, they go to what's familiar. And if you're in a situation, National Football League, let's say, where you've got 31 out of 32 of the club owners are white, and you force them to make a split-second decision, or a 1-day or 3-day or 1-week decision on who will be the head coach of their club, I think a lot of them may tend toward the familiar, which might mean an advantage going to a white head coaching candidate. But if you slow everybody down and give them time, I think it reduces the disadvantage that candidates of color have. One of the proposals that's been made to the league in recent years is to require that slowing down, that perhaps you shouldn't be able to interview for you shouldn't be able to interview a head coaching candidate or hire a head coach until 6 weeks after the end of the regular season, giving everybody time to calm down and cool out and make deliberate decisions. The league has not adopted that approach. I personally think that it would be a beneficial approach. There's some reasons organizationally why maybe it would create some complications, but I think that sort of thinking, how do we find ways to slow down the decision making would be beneficial for any entity, NFL or any other entity that adopts the Rooney Rule, to implement so as to reduce the disadvantage that candidates of color feel.
Yeah, and to your point, look, I'll go ahead, John. I was going to say, just look what happened to Eric Bieniemy this past year with the Chiefs. I mean, he was really a victim of the process being too fast for him because he was too busy winning the Super Bowl. So, sorry, Jim, go ahead.
Well, let me address both statements because I think there's just so much there. Where what Jeremy discussed plays out, I believe, even more and has a big impact on the pipeline is, there's this belief you hire your head coach and then that person has to hire everyone up right away, or they're going to, they're going to go to other jobs. And there is some reality to that. But if you look, at the turnover in coaches, clearly, every one of those decisions is not the most effective decision ever made, because you wouldn't have not just the head coaching turnover, but the turnover in the assistant job. So slowing the process down on the assistant level may be more crucial. And right now we're not in that direction. So there is, it's really important what Jeremy says, and that's, we're all talking about, hey, we're going to reflect on our situation to make ourselves better. Well, here's clearly an opportunity to do that. So I think that's important. The second thing is the Eric Bieniemy situation is just so flabbergasting. And again, I get how things work in the NFL, and that people feel like they need their coach, working by the second or third week of January. But in the most crucial moments of the league, the playoffs, the Super Bowl, and then the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl, this gentleman, had the highest performance. His outcomes were the best they've ever been. Now, right. I'm all for the interview process. We talk about the Rooney Rule process, but performance has to be some indicator of someone you want in a job. And he had literally the highest performance anyone has ever had. In each of those games, he was down by more than 10 points. Their offense ends up winning the game.
Right.
So it's just such a flabbergasting situation to look at the Eric Bieniemy case this past year. Yeah.
I wonder if we could maybe just take a kind of a 30,000-foot view of this whole thing. And I mean, recently you had the fashion industry come out and say they're going to adopt like a similar, rule like the Rooney Rule, where they're looking to increase inclusivity at the top and in different positions. And I wonder maybe if you could both just talk about how this approach can really be applied to other sectors outside of the NFL, outside of sports in general even, and how critical addressing the issue of inclusive leadership and inclusive hiring is to creating positive change in regards to larger issues of systemic racism. How critical is that piece of inclusive leadership and inclusive hiring?
Yeah, the second part of your question, look, we say we want organizations, institutions to look different. The entrance point is the hiring process. So it absolutely is, if not the most critical point, a very fundamental point, because that is where you're going to, bring folks that look, sound, have a different experience, whatever it might be, into your organization. So absolutely the hiring process is so critical there. The Stanford Business School had a conversation about diversity policies last year. It was the Stanford Business School Board of Directors, and I was told this, sort of off the cuff. So I'm not gonna reveal my source there. But they all came to the conclusion that, look, a Rooney Rule component is the most effective way to do it, because you're going to have to create situations where you're hiring and exploring multiple candidates. You can't go to the point where you're going to say at CEO level jobs or C-suite level jobs that we're only going to have any one group in that. That's not the responsibility of the organization. So that the idea that you're going to include folks in the hiring process, whether it's one candidate in the pool, which we can talk about, or I think more significantly, more than one candidate in the pool, which has demonstrated even a greater level of success, that it is creating that diverse slate, which is fundamentally the Rooney Rule. We've gotten some bad press with the NFL over the last couple of years. So if folks need to change the name, certainly my father, I believe, would have no problem changing the name if we got to the outcomes that are, the drivers behind the rule.
Yeah, I would just say, Jim hit the nail right on the head on the inclusive leadership point. I would say that when we think about the Rooney Rule concept, I know it's it's the NFL rule, but it really has nothing to do with football, obviously, right? It's just a rule that we've seen getting its greatest exposure through football. There were entities before the NFL that implemented the diverse candidate slate concept, and now there are entities of all sorts that have this sort of concept. Major municipalities, Pittsburgh's got it. Portland, Oregon's got it. The state of Oregon has it with respect to head coaches and athletic directors. You've got the Democrats and the Senate and the House who've got it. Entities throughout Silicon Valley have it. So it's gotten traction all over the place, and there's no reason it shouldn't. And by the way, it can go beyond race. So in Portland, Oregon, the Rooney Rule concept applies with respect to person of color, a woman, and a person with a disability being considered. So, you can really blend this thing and move it around in whatever way fits your particular circumstance. But whatever the circumstance is, I think the Rooney Rule concept has something to offer.
One more point I'll add to what Jeremy said. We're going back and forth here. I'm glad we got to this point. But in the new upgrade in the NFL, the vice president jobs throughout the league require Rooney Rule with gender and sexual orientation. So those are now included, and I think that is so important that you're really going to get. May take longer than we would like on certain levels, but you're going to get the entire culture of these organizations to change. And I think when that happens, hiring decisions themselves, my hope is certainly that it has a exponential effect throughout the entire line.
Jim Rooney of the Pittsburgh Steelers, author of A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's Story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. Jeremi Duru, professor of sports law at American University and counsel to the Fritz Pollard Alliance. Can't thank you both enough for taking time and going overtime to join us here on Champions of Change the Rise podcast. Really, thank you so much.